Welcome to class today. This is your professor, Adam Dunstan, and today we are going to be talking about religion. And the subtitle for this lecture is I Saved the Best for Last, because this is my favorite topic to lecture about. In fact, I teach a whole separate other class called Anthropology of Religion under the ANTH A490C label, if you're ever interested in taking it from me. So this is Module 13, Religion, and it's not actually the last lecture. We've got a couple others after this, so don't stop attending class or something. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Azande Witchcraft reading that you did. So the Azande are a group of people who live in the nations that are now known as Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan primarily. This is an ethnic group of about 1 million people who primarily engage in farming, small-scale farming, as their subsistence activity. The reading I had you do is, at this point, about 90 years old from Evans Pritchard from 1937. I guess that makes it about 80 years old. And most people are typically struck by Evans Pritchard's tone. His tone at the same time probably shouldn't shock us because he was writing from a position of being British, not Azande. He was writing from the position of this being the 1930s, when this area, Azande land, was British colony, if I'm not mistaken. And he was also writing from a time period where in the social sciences and sciences, things were very, and I would say this is still the case in many cases, but secularist oriented in the sense that an anthropologist was supposed to look for the quote unquote rational or empirical causes of religious behavior. Nowadays in anthropology, we try not to explain away people's religious beliefs and instead just try to kind of understand them and how they fit within that society. But at the time Evans Pritchard was writing, it was not uncommon for anthropologists to basically be like, well, this is clearly not true. And when they say clearly not true, they're sort of relying on their own sort of post-Enlightenment secular European anthropology background. So you'll notice that Evans Pritchard sometimes comes off somewhat dismissive of Azande beliefs, despite having spent considerable time there doing fieldwork. So for example, when he says, quote, witches as the Azande conceive of them clearly cannot exist. However, at the same time, even though Evans Pritchard's tone in this regard is, I think, demeaning of Azande beliefs, I still have you do this reading, and you might ask yourself why. Well, of course, it's always helpful to read things from 80 years ago and kind of see how far we've come, and hopefully nowadays when we write or communicate, whether we're writing on a social media post or a blog post, or just communicating with a friend, hopefully we speak more respectful of religious practices of others. But the other reason I have you read this is because I think it has some really good points to it about religion, that even though Evans Pritchard's tone is, as I say, somewhat demeaning to the empirical reality of Azande beliefs, it's clear from the way he wrote that he doesn't believe in Azande witchcraft. At the same time, Evans Pritchard's makes a really interesting point, which is that, he could totally see why some people would believe in Azande witchcraft, because he basically makes the case that Azande witchcraft beliefs are perfectly logical and rational. So at the time, to put this in context, at the time this was actually a fairly radical point, because at the time, as Britain and other European nations were engaging in colonialism, sometimes brutal colonialism in Africa, there was a tendency among European observers to observe non-Christian, non-Islamic African traditions such as Azande witchcraft and divination and look at them as fundamentally irrational, fundamentally different from Western forms of religiosity. Like, oh, that's superstition, that's craziness, that's nonsense, these people just need to learn more or something like that. So there's definitely racist and colonial tones to that, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. So Evans Pritchard's point was actually somewhat radical, somewhat progressive for his time period. He was saying, no, this isn't irrational, this isn't superstitious, this isn't nonsense. He kind of spells out how Azande witchcraft provides a really cohesive worldview by which Azande people at the time were understanding themselves in the world around them. As he points out, Azande people certainly understand that illnesses and injuries and misfortunes are caused by natural causes and effects, right? They're not irrational in any way. People know that when a granary collapses because the termites ate out the foundation, it's because the termites ate the foundation. They know that when a kid stubs his toe, it's because the kid stubbed his toe, right? They know that an illness is an illness. and as he points out, they're entirely every bit as rational or logical as any other culture, he says, and they don't use witchcraft to explain all bad things that happen to them. Instead, he points out that Zande, at the time, and these, I think, have persisted, if not to the present day, at least till relatively recently. He says, though, that, at the time, Zande people were using witchcraft not to explain everything, not as sort of some catch-all mysticism that covers every single thing, but instead, as he pointed out, Zande people used witchcraft as an idea to explain why specific bad things happened at specific times to specific people, right? So, this is a question really that's familiar to all cultures. Most cultures, if not all cultures, have some way of explaining this, or at least a lot do. Why? Why did this bad thing happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why did this bad thing happen to my family? Why was my family member hurt or struck by this tragedy? We get the cause and effect. When we ask a question like that, it's not that we don't understand the cause and effect, for example, of a car crash that causes a serious injury. We get how cars work and we get how crashes work. But much like the Azande people, any of us are looking for an answer, I think, to, well, why did that happen to me? Or why did that happen to my family member? The cosmos feels unjust or unequal, and so we seek for understanding, and we find understanding in many ways. Within sort of hegemonic Western cultural systems, God's will is still a very common way of explaining why bad things happen in specific instances. This must be part of God's bigger plan, and there's a purpose here. Or sometimes people will talk of bad luck, right? The idea that certain practices or behaviors are bad luck. Or sometimes people talk about, coincidence, which, as Evans Pritchard points out, the coincidence doesn't really explain anything. It just says that two things happened at the same time. So we all sort of seek for ways of explaining it, right? Within Hinduism, you have karma, and reincarnation. You have so many different ways as different cultures that we try to explain why things happen. Traditionally, within Yupik society, here sort of in the Cook Inlet region and then further north into Alaska, you had this idea prior to Christianization that some diseases were caused by really obvious things, but other diseases that were more mysterious were caused by spiritual forces, negative spiritual forces that had to be grappled with by the shamans. So my point is that cultures the world over try to understand why specific bad things are happening in specific ways to specific people, and try to find a cosmic meaning and not just a cause and effect meaning. We want to know that our cosmos is a balanced, just, understandable one, that we don't just live in chaos. And so, as Evans Pritchard is saying, Zande witchcraft makes sense from that point of view. They use witchcraft not to explain cause and effect, but instead to explain the cosmos and sort of why cause and effect plays out the way it does in certain people's lives. And their explanation is based on the idea that certain people possess within them a substance, which we could translate into English as, quote, witchcraft, which they may not even be aware of, and which, when they are jealous or provoked to anger, can go out and afflict other people with harm. And so very often, if somebody's sick, or they have a really unusual accident, right? Like, I'm always careful when I walk down this path, but for some reason this day when I walked down the path, I wasn't careful and hit this stump, and it hit on exactly the right part of my toe, that now it's going to fester and infect. If I'd hit it any other way, it wouldn't have done that, right? So when things happen that are particularly terrible, or, the granary collapsed, sure, but it collapsed right when a kid was standing underneath it. So when there are these particularly terrible or strange circumstances, they often, and I should say historically, but I think a lot of these practices have persisted either up to the present day or close to the present day. I know at least through the 80s, this was still common for many Zande people. Anyways, when illness happens, or a very strange circumstance, to consult with a diviner who can do a mystical ritual, such as the ANTH oracle, where you stick a stick within an ant hill or termite mound and see where they go. Different forms of divination, the Benge oracle, where you pour poison down a chicken's throat and see how it responds. Different ways of sort of divining or speaking to the spirit world and trying to figure out if witchcraft did occur and who did the witchcraft. And oftentimes what is found out is that the person who did the witchcraft is somebody who was jealous, would naturally be jealous of the person who was afflicted. Maybe one common example would be if two women are married to the same man, it's not uncommon when one of the women gets a strange sickness for the diviner to look into it and conclude that the other wife has been to blame, that she has witchcraft. And so oftentimes the way this is dealt with is not sort of the way it was dealt with in Salem in our own American history, but instead through a really nonviolent ritual of drinking cool water and renouncing your witchcraft to calm your witchcraft down within you. So it's socially, I guess, a little embarrassing, but it's not a violent ritual. It's not an execution. Certainly in many other cultures, people that are perceived as having engaged in evil magic might be ostracized or even executed in extreme circumstances, but in this case, that specific ritual is really just a non-violent way of doing it, and in doing so, it sort of brings to whatever your perception of whether or not Azande witchcraft exists, the practice of going through this process of trying to figure out who might have afflicted who's jealous of whom, kind of brings a bunch of social grievances to light and allows people to talk about them and potentially work through them and process them, not entirely unlike group therapy within our own culture. Or family therapy. And so, I think some important points are made here from the Azande witchcraft example. So, some take-homes I like to point out. Number one is we tend to misunderstand religions that are very different than the ones we're familiar with. Sometimes we misunderstand the religions we are familiar with, but we certainly often misunderstand religions that we're not familiar with. I spoke last time in class about Wiccan pentagrams that were for many years, you may not have, I don't think I mentioned this part, but for many years, military members who had died in combat could not have a pentagram put on their gravestone in the National Cemetery. That was relatively recently that was changed legally. And so, people misunderstand the pentagram as a Wiccan symbol and associate it with Satan worship. So we often misunderstand the beliefs of others, just like those British people were misunderstanding Azande beliefs. And then, Evans Pritchard had to kind of come along and say, well, this actually makes a lot of sense. These folks are every bit as smart as any other group of people. They just have a different way of explaining things. If you believe that witchcraft substance exists, this is a totally logical way of thinking through problems, because they don't use it to explain basic cause and effect. They use it to explain sort of cosmic questions that we all grapple with. So again, they're every bit as, Azande witchcraft beliefs are every bit as smart as anybody else's beliefs. So he says, so my take home there is, we tend to misunderstand others' beliefs and think of them as illogical or think of them as simplistic, while giving ourselves perhaps credit that, our beliefs are smarter, whether those are religious beliefs or political beliefs or other kinds of beliefs. So we need to kind of have a dose of humility when we start to examine the religions of others. Another take home is that we can all do better at that. So, I sometimes like to ask my students, are we beyond this? It's 2020. People surely would not speak about African non-Christian religious practices that way today, right? I think you would be aghast if somebody was speaking like that in your classroom. But, you hear other things. You hear people talk that in mocking ways, for example, about Catholic beliefs about transubstantiation of the Eucharist, the idea that the host or the bread becomes Christ's body. You hear people talk in mocking ways about Jehovah's Witnesses beliefs. You hear people talk about in mocking ways about a lot of religious beliefs. And so you hear people say things about Islam that are simply not accurate or are a skewed perspective based on, a very specific subgroup. And so I don't think we're beyond this. I think this is a lesson we all need to hear sometimes, is that, we can do better. And maybe like Evans Pritchard, we can even do better when we think we're doing pretty good. Evans Pritchard's, he was doing great, but he, relative to his time period, but we look back at it 80 years later and say, wow, Evans Pritchard, kind of condescending words, and perhaps people 80 years from now will say the same things about us. Nonetheless, I think, we can always be making that effort to be more culturally and religiously aware. Final take home is cultural relativism, really back to the start of this course, the idea that you have to understand cultural practices in their context to make sense of them. Very much holds true with religious beliefs and practices. Typically, religious beliefs and practices make sense within that worldview. That doesn't mean that they make sense in every worldview, right? Something like an exorcism doesn't make sense outside the worldview necessarily. But if you believe in the reality of demons, then an exorcism may make all the sense in the world. And so religious beliefs and practices typically make sense within their worldview. That's not always true. Of course, any religion, just like any culture, can pick up beliefs or practices that are just kind of random and kind of come out of nowhere. But for the most part, when you're dealing with other people's sincere beliefs and practices, they come out as somewhere. They don't just come out of nowhere. And so it's kind of our job as anthropologists, or in your case, as just, people taking an anthropology class, to try to understand the points of view of the people around you. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. A point we talk about in anthropology is bracketing, our point basically being that sometimes you have to bracket off. Sometimes as anthropologists, we have to say, well, this is an issue we can't prove or disprove, right? There's no way to put ghosts in a test tube, and so we're not going to prove or disprove this culture's beliefs about ghosts, and we're not going to try to. Instead, as anthropologists, we're going to try to understand how it affects their society and how it affects their culture. So for us as anthropologists, when we talk about religion, we're not trying to prove or disprove. That's a matter for theologians and priests and, people. Instead, what we're trying to do is simply understand religions as a cultural and social force. And as we see with the Azande example, they are a huge social force, people that affect people's social relationships and how we decide who's to blame for different things. So that's going to be kind of some of the themes that are going to start us into our lecture now.